Returns. We all love them, right? Few things get a wrestling fan's heart pumping like hearing the theme of a long-forgotten superstar, or to see someone who's been gone from the public eye for years making a surprise comeback. Take, for instance,
Woo, woo, woo. You know it.
what a wild ride it's been for Matt Cardona. After years of killing it on the indies while practically begging to get re-signed by WWE, Zack Ryder emerged from the ashes this last month during John Cena's final opponent sweepstakes tournament to huge fanfare. And if you remember his first run in the company, then you know how huge a deal this was for Ryder and all his broskies. For the fans to react the way that they did, it had to be a form of vindication for Cardona and all his hard work. Who knows what the long term will look like for Ryder's return, but regardless, this is one example of a wrestler who many never expected to come back to the WWE family. But when it comes to shock value, honestly, Zack Ryder hardly registers compared to these, my picks for the top 8 least likely returns in WWE history. Be sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet, hit the bell icon, the like button, the hype button, all the damn buttons. Let's begin. Number 8. Goldberg. From the billionaire Ted skits to DVDs packed with historical revision, it was always pretty obvious how much contempt Vince McMahon had for WCW. Well, that and the way he booked pretty much every former star who made the move to New York. To the WWF, being famous somewhere else before getting there is one of the worst sins you could possibly commit. In an era where former WCW stars were booked seemingly to prove a point, no one got it worse than Bill Goldberg in 2003. From the beginning, WWE seemed determined to undermine and neutralize everything that got Goldberg over in the first place, changing his theme music, putting him in longer matches, more promos, and goofy backstage skits. The real-life heat he accrued with certain talent didn't help much either. Nevertheless, it seemed like a no-brainer that Berg would beat an injured Triple H for the world title at SummerSlam, but even that got delayed after Goldberg refused to replace the H-Man on an overseas tour. He would finally win the title 1 month later at Unforgiven, but by that point the moment had passed, and he would drop it back to Triple H 3 months later at Armageddon. Goldberg moved into a feud with fellow sentient water heater Brock Lesnar for WrestleMania 20, only for it to be revealed days before the show that both men were leaving WWE afterward, creating one of the most bizarre lame duck scenarios for a high-profile match in Mania history. It was so bad that in the end, all the focus went toward the special guest referee, Stone Cold Steve Austin, who also left for a while after the show. Goldberg vanished from the American wrestling landscape for more than a decade, until in 2016 when he was announced as a bonus character in the latest WWE video game, a blatant psyop in hindsight that led to him coming back for reals at that year's Survivor Series. Okay guys, let's calm down for a second. We all remember what happened the last time these two wrestled, right? And now it's 13 years later, Goldberg hasn't been doing shit, Brock's been this unkillable boss for a couple of years now. This match is going to suck.
Goldberg again with a spear on Jackhammer to Lesnar. Oh my God! Goldberg beat Brock.
Huh. It took them long enough, but WWE finally figured out how to book Goldberg competently, and it paid off in a successful feud between he and Lesnar through Mania 33. Though the returns diminished greatly with each subsequent moment, particularly his Saudi matches with Bray Wyatt and The Undertaker, the initial comeback seemed to wipe out the sins of 2003 overnight. It was a rare case of WWE showcasing a WCW star in a way that made sense, albeit far later than they should have. Number 7. Jeff Jarrett. But which WWE return, you might ask? It's kind of hard to narrow it down because there have been so many over the years. Hell, by the time you watch this video, he might be back there again. A lot of names jumped from company to company in the 1990s, but few turned it into an art form quite like Double J, who had 2 stints in both major feds during the Monday Night War. After debuting for the WWF as a Porter Wagner-esque wannabe crooner and spending 5 months in Memphis due to issues with booking, Jarrett left entirely over a contract dispute and went to WCW in the fall of 1996. There he became somewhat of a horseman before hopping back to the Federation 1 year later, where he immediately buried himself by cutting a promo where he called Austin 316 blasphemous, pissing off the Golden Goose and keeping him far away from any main event aspirations. Jarrett still managed to cut out a niche for himself and find his final form during this run. He lost the long locks and the weird chest straps and became synonymous with guitar shots and saying edgy things like, "Don't piss me off, slapnuts." Jarrett again jumped to WCW in October of '99, but not before taking his pound of flesh on the way out. Double J was technically operating without a contract the night of the No Mercy pay-per-view and refused to do the honors for China until the WWF paid him every last cent they still owed him to the tune of nearly $200,000. The grudge against Jarrett was very much alive on the evening of the final Nitro when Vince McMahon singled out Jeff and publicly fired him on the air. Long story short, Jarrett helped create what is now TNA Wrestling, altering the landscape of wrestling in America in ways that are still being felt to this day and creating the closest thing WWE had to competition until AEW began. Then there was the stuff with Global Force Wrestling, but I feel like that's something for another time. Fast forward to 2018, when Jarrett, Mr. GOONNE himself, got inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. When you consider all the times Jarrett left Vince McMahon high and dry, for all the times they were on opposing sides of the battlefield, for founding TNA, it is baffling to me they would find enough common ground for Jarrett to receive the company's highest honor, only for him to leave again in 2021, come back again for a minute in 22, then jump to AEW later that same year, where he still is as of this recording. Give it up for Jeff Jarrett, wrestling's most employed man. Number 6, the New World Order. Hulk Hogan, Scott Hall, and Kevin Nash. With the way the wrestling business works, in hindsight I guess it wasn't that huge a shock they would eventually come back to the WWF. But at the time, who could have guessed? Let's see. Hulk Hogan left the Federation in 1994 amid steroid allegations and fan fatigue, then later testified against Vince McMahon in his steroid trial in 1995. Meanwhile, Hall and Nash jumped at the chance to work fewer dates for more money, so they left the WWF in 1996. That same summer, all three men worked together to help WCW become the #1 promotion in the country, all while taking shots at their former employer and generating abysmal backstage attitudes. So yeah, I'm thinking those things, in a nutshell, would be some strong reasons not to be welcomed back. But once WCW went under and all the riffraff was taken care of during the invasion, it was only a matter of time before Vince would try and make money with the ones who got away. Despite protests from most of the locker room, both on screen and IRL, Hogan, Hall, and Nash were brought in as part of a storyline that saw an unhinged McMahon try to destroy the company from within in protest to Ric Flair owning half of the WWF.
If anybody's gonna kill my creation, I'm gonna do it. Me. And the NWO.
Even after that, I didn't believe it until the following Raw, when Vince pointed to the Tron to reveal the shot of all three men together. It was a dopamine rush I hadn't felt since that one part of the invasion when the ECW guys turned on Jericho and Kane. Even in my still young wrestling fan brain, I found the justification for them coming back to be a bit ludicrous. But even more than that, all of them returning under the NWO banner felt like a downgrade. Never mind the fact that WCW itself had ruined the NWO brand by the time the company went under. But by that point, Hogan and the Outsiders were so far removed from one another, I found it really weird they'd all be one unit again. But you have to remember, this wasn't WCW's version of the NWO. It was the WWF's idea of the WCW's version of the NWO. Big difference. Then it finally happened at No Way Out 2002 in February. The band was back in the WWF, but it took less than 2 months for the company to realize that this idea wasn't it, Chief. Part of it was due to Nash's propensity for injury and Hall's ongoing substance abuse issues. Another part of it being fans really just wanted to cheer for Hulk Hogan again. A newer, muddled version of the order limped along until July of that year, when Nash, having just returned from a bicep injury, tore his quad in his first match back, 2 months after Hall had been fired. Meanwhile, the Hulkster had one of the greatest comeback runs of all time, turning babyface again, returning to the red and yellow, receiving thunderous ovations, and becoming the last person to officially hold the WWF title before it became WWE. This version of the NWO may not have lasted, but it seemed like a neat idea at the time. Number 5. Brock Lesnar. Again, there have been a lot of times this guy has surprisingly come back over the last decade or so, and the most recent one being particularly shocking in its own way, but for the purpose of this countdown, I want to go back to the beginning. Brock Lesnar burst on the scene in March of 2002 with an undeniable and awe-inspiring physical presence that fast-tracked him to the WWE Championship a mere 6 months later at the tender age of 25. But a mixture of burnout, travel, injuries, and disagreements over booking had Lesnar ready to walk away just 2 years later. Hence, he and Bill Goldberg shitting the bed at Madison Square Garden at Mania 20. After failing to find a home in pro football, a sport known for its lack of issues regarding burnout, travel, and injuries, Lesnar waged a fierce legal battle with WWE, who claimed that their contract with the next big thing prohibited him from wrestling or fighting anywhere in the world for another 6 years. Let me repeat that. WWE thought they could keep an independent contractor locked up for 6 years. And we think the stuff with Andrade today is messed up? Lesnar was at least able to wrestle sporadically in Japan until the suit was settled in 2006. Then MMA came calling, and Brock's fate was sealed forever. Finally, in 2012, 2 years after that original no-compete clause would have ended, the man who conquered WWE and UFC in record time came back with no warning to feud with John Cena. As someone who was an overall huge fan of Brock during that initial run, I was really stoked to see him finally come back. After so many years being gone, I assumed he was never going to return, which at that time was a bad thing. Thus began a strange hot and cold relationship between Lesnar and WWE that exists to this day. He's out, he's back in, he's out, he's back in, and during all those returns, he basically gets to do what he wants because he's Brock Lesnar, I guess. It took an 8-year hiatus and having unmitigated success outside of the wrestling bubble, but the Beast is basically living out the career he probably would have had from the start had he just stuck around. Number 4, The Ultimate Warrior. Once again on this countdown, we have to look at a repeat returner and try to figure out which one turned heads the most. But it wasn't the one in 1992 when he came back looking so different that some fans thought he had died and was replaced by Kerry Von Erich. Nor was it the one in 96 that only lasted for a few months and saw him sticking out like a sore thumb. Obviously, they pale in comparison to his final comeback. You have to remember all that had taken place between Warrior and Vince McMahon during all those years. A series of power plays over money and dates, legal battles over the Warrior's name and legacy. In 2005, Warrior turned down the chance to work alongside WWE in producing a DVD about his career, so they used the opportunity to bury the shit out of him on said DVD. It was such a vicious takedown that it became synonymous with the company's absolute pettiness. Yet somehow in 2013, it was his surprising inclusion in the upcoming 2K14 game that led to a meeting and reconciliation between Warrior and Vince McMahon. After years of contention and anger, all the issues from before were seemingly water under the bridge, and suddenly UW's headlined the 2014 Hall of Fame. Of course, it's a comeback made even more shocking by its timing, as Warrior would pass away from a heart attack 3 days after his induction and 1 day after his final on-air appearance on the Raw after WrestleMania 30. Going from the ultimate bitter ex-employee to a deified company icon was a pivot that few would have ever seen coming from the Warrior. But when it came to the former WWF champion, expecting the unexpected was par for the course. Number 3, CM Punk. If you told me a decade ago that CM Punk would not only come back to WWE, but that he'd also get a WrestleMania main event and become world champion again, I would have thought you were crazy. Considering what led to his departure and everything after that, it just seemed like a sure thing that he was never coming back.
Never ever, never ever ever. They're gonna go crazy about
They
that
really
on
are.
Twitter.
From the moment Charles Montgomery Punk stepped on the scene in WWE in 2006, it seemed he would have an uphill battle. His look, his background, and his personality seemed to make him totally incompatible with WWE culture, yet the fan support was too strong for the company to keep him on the back burner all the time. Then we all know the story. After the 2014 Royal Rumble, a sick and burnt out Punk told the powers that be what he thought of them and went home to heal, only to be fired later that year on his wedding day. Punk went scorched earth on the company in an infamous podcast interview with then buddy Colt Cabana, the fallout of which would wind up killing their friendship. And through all of it, through the interviews, the side projects, the massive CM Punk chants that could be heard every week on WWE TV, Punk seemingly stuck to his guns about leaving wrestling behind. Now, AEW does deserve credit for bringing the Punker back into wrestling in 2021. But when you think about it, they also deserve credit for nearly driving him away again 2 years later. Before he went to AEW, simply seeing Punk wrestle again felt like a fantasy for some fans, much less coming back to WWE. But when he showed up at Survivor Series 23, it was like a cheat code had been activated. If the guy who became the face of anti-WWE vitriol for a decade was able to come back into the fold, then anything was possible. Still, realistically, I give it 9 months. For this video to age a whole lot better than the last time I talked about him. Number 2, Bret Hart. If my workplace had kicked me out of the office in a really public and embarrassing way before my contract was officially up, I'd probably not want to go back there ever again. Now, if 2 years later that same company pulled a really silly stunt with faulty equipment resulting in the death of my brother, I definitely would never want to do business with them again. But I guess that's why I'm not the best there is, the best there was, and the best there ever will be. Whether you agree with Bret Hart or Vince McMahon on what happened in Montreal that fateful night in 1997, you'd be right to think that a bridge was nuked regardless. It was the end result of allowing months of backstage bickering and infighting to fester, an unwinnable situation in which no outcome was going to make everyone happy. The Montreal Screwjob was the beginning of a long and agonizing line of personal and professional tragedies for Bret and his family. One could make the argument that it ultimately led to Owen Hart's fatal fall at Over the Edge 99. And to add insult to injury, Bret was painted for years as being needlessly bitter about it, his most infamous moment copied and parodied countless times for the lulz. Fast forward to 2005, when word got out that WWE was planning on producing a DVD on the career of the Hitman. Considering how the company had just treated the Ultimate Warrior when he didn't play ball with them, perhaps Bret wanted to avoid a similar fate and negotiated the use of hours of his own footage for the project, presumably in exchange for more of a Ric Flair DVD treatment. Bret finally accepted an induction into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2006, though he kept his distance from the overall product until finally coming back in 2010, first as a Raw guest host and eventually a short-lived GM. Considering the bad blood and strife that came from the Montreal Screwjob between the workers, the fans, even members of the Hart family itself, it's a miracle that Bret was ever willing to return to Vince McMahon and WWE under any circumstance. But in the end, Bret is a very proud man who was aware of the power the company had in building a narrative, so he made a smart decision to benefit his career and his legacy. It's a complicated matter, but then again, isn't that at the heart of every great wrestling story? Before I reveal the number 1 entrant, here are a few honorable mentions, including one who I feel really bad that I couldn't make fit into the top 8. Sable. When you come of age during the height of the Attitude Era, you grow up pretty fast. And for me, the story of Sable in the WWF was one of the first instances of me learning about the seedier side of this whole wrestling thing. By 1998, Rena Mero, aka Sable, had become the WWF's hottest property aside from Stone Cold Steve Austin. Debuting in '96 as the valet for her husband Mark Mero, the buxom blonde soon eclipsed him and left her co-worker Sunny in the shade. She was so popular, the WWF put her in the ring against her wishes and even revived their women's championship as a showcase for her and her talents. But apparently a year of success and a prominent spread in Playboy magazine went straight to her head as Sable's backstage attitude garnered white-hot levels of heat with the wrestlers and the office. So much so that on her and Mark's last night with the company at a UK pay-per-view, they became the victims of one of X-Pac's classic poop-related ribs. Sable later filed a $110 million sexual harassment lawsuit against the Federation. In it, she claimed the company turned against her when she refused to go topless on television, which seems like a dubious claim when she basically did just that at Fully Loaded a year earlier. But when you consider Vince McMahon's history with female employees over the decades, you'd be crazy to think there wasn't some smoke there. Rena rebelled by doing another Playboy spread under her own name, and she even appeared in the crowd on a June '99 episode of Nitro, a moment that ultimately went nowhere. The lawsuit was settled that summer, and besides a brief run as the CEO of the XWF in late 2001, that seemed to be the end of Sable's time in wrestling.
Thank you, and welcome to everyone.
Do we have a main event for this week here in XWF?
Now, Gene, you know it's not my place to make the matches.
Well, I guess that raised her stock because after WrestleMania 19 in 2003, Sable bafflingly came back to WWE to play the role of Mr. McMahon's assistant and obvious mistress. All the scandal and skis of the Vince and Trish storyline with none of the intrigue or payoff, but also a lot less of the Linda. So I guess that's an improvement. Considering what she sued WWE for in the first place, this kind of booking felt like a big deliberate fuck you to her. At least she met her future husband Brock Lesnar while still married to Mark Marrow and finally bounced from the company on good terms in August of 2004. Cody Rhodes. Seeing the writing on the wall following his father's death in 2015, Cody Rhodes was determined to prove the WWE hierarchy wrong and boldly requested his release the following year. He went on to have a crazy run in the independents while also performing for Impact, Ring of Honor, and New Japan. Then came All In, which proved that a non-WWE entity could draw 10,000 folks, as long as it wasn't branded as ROH apparently. Nevertheless, All In soon led to AEW, and for better or for worse, depending on perspective, the wrestling world has never been the same. Cody had a major hand in making AEW a reality. He's a founding father. He planted his flag in AEW. He drove a sledgehammer through a throne there. He bled buckets and burned his flesh for AEW. Many fans believed he would never leave until he did. We may never get the full unredacted story as to why the Codester left the company he helped get on the map, but the opportunity to return to the place where he got his start and finish the story, as they say, was much too good to pass up. Since making his not-so-secret return at WrestleMania 38 in 2022, Cody's become the company's top man, arguably second only to Roman Reigns, all while remaining the version of himself he had crafted while away from WWE. The Road Warriors. So badly did Vince McMahon want the Road Warriors, he made his own version of them in Demolition, then threw them away like broken toys when he got the real thing. But the Warriors, especially Hawk, did not seem well suited for the rigors of the WWF. To make matters worse, McMahon saddled them with the unbelievably stupid Rocco puppet for a mascot. But Hawk sure taught them a lesson by working SummerSlam at Wembley Stadium loaded out of his gourd, then getting lost in London for a couple of weeks following the event. With the Monday Night War heating up, Animal and Hawk came back to the WWF in 1997 and had a pretty decent run at first. Then, well...
Get a shirt. No. Oh, what? God almighty.
Soon after a very dumb storyline that played up Hawk's real-life drug issues, the LOD left and spent years burying Vince across multiple shoot interviews. Bret Hart is far from the first person to accuse McMahon and Shawn Michaels of sleeping together. That's all I'm saying.
I could never understand it. I said, there's something going on here. I think it's a, I used to call it a ball and cock contract.
But somehow, in spite of all that, the Road Warriors made one final return in 2003 as a surprise opponents for Kane and Rob Van Dam. It also served as a tryout for another possible full-time run, but the two were a far cry from the badasses who debuted on TBS some 2 decades earlier, and Hawk sadly passed away later that same year. Jesse Ventura. Though Roddy Piper arguably originated the role of heel commentator in the early 80s, it was his pal Jesse who used it to greater fame and notoriety, getting into prominent movie roles and other endorsements despite no longer wrestling. But a dispute over his potential partnership in a non-WWF wrestling game caused Ventura to suddenly leave the company in the summer of 1990. And oh yeah, there was that time Hulk Hogan shot down his attempts at forming a union. While on the outs, Ventura sued the Federation over his commentary being used on their home videos and won nearly $400,000 in past royalties. This led to the company scrubbing his voice from DVD releases in the early 2000s, creating a very strange phenomenon of Gorilla Monsoon talking to himself. In '99, Jesse shocked the world when he was voted the governor of Minnesota. It was impossible for the WWF not to capitalize on, as they brought him back as a special guest referee for the main event of SummerSlam '99 in his home state. Jesse made a couple of token appearances in the years since, but when Vince was ousted for good in 2024, the body was welcomed back to renew his role as heel commentator for Saturday night's main event. But again, Jesse proved himself to be too much of a free thinker and stopped getting booked after he buried the finish of the Drew McIntyre-Damian Priest cage match live on the air.
How do you win it going out the door?
Well, that's the
I thought you had to go over the top.
About this
What
speed.
kind of BS is that?
And my pick for the least likely return in WWE history is Bruno Sammartino. There used to be a time when wrestling was taken a lot more seriously, especially by the wrestlers themselves, and there was no more steadfast a traditionalist than Bruno. After being a full-time competitor for 2 decades, the record-smashing former world champ transitioned into a commentary role alongside Vince McMahon Jr. in 1984. But during this time, Bruno became increasingly disapproving of Vince's vision of sports entertainment, the rampant drug use consuming the locker room, the rise of steroids, not to mention the booking of his son, David Sammartino. All those things caused the living legend to say enough was enough and leave the company altogether. For the next 3 decades, Sammartino staunchly represented the old guard, often taking to the media to decry McMahon for being, quote, a sick-minded idiot, among other things. During the Ring Boy scandal and the steroid trial, you would often find Bruno front and center on the side of fuck Vince. What's crazy is that pretty much everyone on this list either did something bad to WWE or WWE did something bad directly to them to justify the animosity. By comparison, I'm pretty sure Bruno was never personally victimized by anyone here. He was just pissed that wrestling had gotten dirty. Bruno's disdain for Vince Jr. and the modern product was generational. No one from that era was doing it like him. We joke about how Bret Hart shoehorns his hatred for Goldberg into every interview. Well, Bruno was like that when it came to practically anything modern. If he lived another 10 years or so, there's no doubt in my mind that his podcast would have made a killing. Finally, in 2013, after rejecting invitations into the Hall of Fame as recently as the year before, the Italian Superman finally changed his tune and accepted his induction into the Hall, giving it a huge amount of legitimacy. It was Triple H who reached out and convinced Bruno that things were different in WWE, citing the company's wellness policy and their efforts in going PG, and that was good enough for Sammartino. For as long as I had known what wrestling was, to me, Bruno represented everything against it. But I'll give him credit. He stood on business, as the kids say, at the risk of hurting his own reputation and his own standing in the business that he loved so dear. I respect him for being able to change his mind after seeing that the company was making efforts to protect talent, even if the business was never going back to the way it was. But man, that guy knew how to put a grudge in a giant bear hug and never let go. For being an all-time hater for longer than some of my viewers have been alive, who had to wait an entire generation to finally be satisfied, Bruno Sammartino is my pick for the least likely return in WWE history. But who else do you think belongs on this list? Let me know in the comment section below. I'm Zane, and I'll see you next time.